Sorry, just go back and forth.
Okay.
We go over here this way.
Over
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you.
All right, shall we begin?
Yes.
No. I just need to show everybody. Whole thing is me, so I'm just
Yeah.
I think if we have it right here, then you will put it.
yeah. I can move this one so you're right. Yeah.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this panel which is focusing on widows. Would you stay silent if you saw a woman, a widow, evicted from her home, subjected to extreme physical violence, forced to remove her children from school and struggling to provide for their food, health care, basic needs? Would you sit by and let this happen to a woman, a widow, whose human rights and social justice were totally violated? Well, that's what this panel is about. This panel is to talk about what are the challenges that widows face and how are we trying to address them, though indeed the subject of widows is quite invisible in the world and assuredly also at the UN. But we're making progress. Okay, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, the Right Honourable Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon in the UK. We are exceedingly privileged to have you with us today.
It's always heartening. You can still squeeze through a narrow gap behind the chairs. I think it's a reflection on my few days here, where you try and grab whatever you can. But first of all, Your Excellencies, Madam First Lady, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour for me to be here with you this morning on such an important subject. And thank you to everyone who does such a crucial job in ensuring that this issue is rising in its profile. I was just saying in our earlier conversation, there is a colleague of mine in the House of Lords in the UK, Lord Lumba, and we have a significant sort of association in that both Raj and I were introduced in the same day on the 17th of January 2011 in the House of Lords. And during that time, he's been a strong advocate for the work he's been doing with various charitable organizations, particularly in India. And so I've had an insight and an understanding of this important issue. But if I may just start off by saying that those of us who lean on the support, love and companionship of a lifelong partner realize very quickly that they can only imagine the pain of losing that person. And whilst we'll go on to the intrinsic levels of support, a personal reflection if I may. My father, who was an incredible inspiration to me, passed away in 2009. It was sudden, and my parents had been married for 48 years. And whilst my mother, anyone who knew her would say that she was formidable in her own right, she was an incredibly talented, inspirational lady to me. She broke down immense barriers for me. I saw a young 69-year-old lady. She was dynamic in every sense, but the loss of her partner suddenly resulted in, sadly, her downward spiral in terms of health until we sadly lost my mother in 2015 at the age of 75. And I saw a young 69-year-old, dynamic in every sense, someone who wasn't, you would say on the face of it, reliant on her partner, but actually her autonomy was her strength. But the loss of my father after 48 years of marriage, I saw for myself directly that whilst there was family support there, whilst the family home remained, my mother, who was very outward going, who was someone who was very passionate about helping others, she used to do a great deal of work in the charitable sector, suddenly found herself becoming very inward looking, very recluse. That happy, incredibly talented, energetic woman fast over that period of 6 years. We saw directly no matter what we did. And why? Because at her core, that loss that she felt, that loneliness she felt. So I reflect on that because that's why this issue is, I suppose, on a very personal level, close to my heart. And it's that first trauma, that first ordeal with profound negative consequences for widows. And when you look around the world, many, not the case of many women in different parts of the country, but there are parts of the world, and I mentioned India, from where my own family originates, where that widow actually relies on her husband. She relies on her partner, not just for economic livelihood, but for many senses of direction. And I think it's equally important that when we look at support for widows, we also look at earlier life interventions in terms of education and economic empowerment, because this is a life cycle, and we need to ensure that we invest early to ensure that any woman who has to go through that trauma is also economically empowered, educated, and has the ability to perhaps deal with some of the challenges that they have to face later in life. Therefore, I come here and I'm delighted to be asked to speak, and I'm humbled and honored to be speaking at this opening session, because it shines a spotlight of galvanizing action on what has been, for far too long, as we've already heard, I would say, I can go as far as saying, a neglected issue, an issue perhaps which isn't understood. And I would like to start by paying tribute to our hosts, the Global Fund for Widows. Your tireless work in every respect in support of widows, bereaved children, that is another aspect. Again, a personal reflection. I saw an aunt of mine at the tender age of 35 with 3 children, emigrated from Karachi to Washington, with the youngest child being only 1, losing her husband at the age of 39. Her life changed. But what made her continue was the fact that she was an educated woman, a talented pharmacist, and she was able to actually provide economically for her children. But even today, and my aunt lives on and she's well and healthy in the US, she still reflects on those very poignant moments of becoming a widow in early age, the support she had to provide for those young children of hers. Thankfully, there was family around her, but not every woman has that family support. And therefore it's right that we come together to underline our support. Widows' rights organizations, but it's not just those active organizations, it's all partners represented here today. And yes, that includes governments as well. And the British government, the United Kingdom government, is fundamentally committed to achieving sustainable development goals. And I believe that improving the life chances of widows is a crucial part of that if we are to end poverty and achieve true gender equality. Although it's challenging to get accurate information, the United Nations itself estimates that there are more than a quarter of a billion, I emphasize that, widows around the world, with more than half of them, 50% of them plus, living in poverty. And as we will hear today, widows can be particularly vulnerable. They can be marginalized, facing deprivation. There's also the issue of stigma. Now, stigma against women, based on which is wrongly sometimes associated through cultural, people talk about cultural limitation. Cultural limitations cannot be, there's a contradiction there, surely. Culture is there to enrich people, not to hold people back. So therefore we must change that narrative. Those who use perhaps erroneously religion or cultural barriers to supporting women, particularly those women who've gone through such a crucial loss, who have relied on their husbands, who have children to look after. We need to ensure that we change that whole emphasis. Because for me, religion is there to guide us. Culture is there to enrich us. And we need to ensure that those who misuse such terms, who misuse such labels, who misuse the context of either religion or culture to hold support for women back, that we face up to it and call it out for what it is. Once widowed, too many women face a denial of inheritance. That is fundamentally wrong. They face a denial of their land rights. That is fundamentally wrong. Degrading and life-threatening burial customs. It's appalling. Not only have you just lost your life partner, you then have to go the worst kind of stigma being attached to your person, the worst kind of pressure and stress over burial customs. And it doesn't end there. In many parts of the world, that abuse continues. And sadly, we know there are a number of widows around the world. It's growing. I have various responsibilities at the British Foreign Office, as Minister for the UN, Minister for the Commonwealth, Minister for Human Rights, amongst other areas. But I'm also the Prime Minister's Special Representative on both freedom of religion or belief and preventing sexual violence in conflict. And therein, when I've been in the field, I've been to places such as Iraq, and I've seen widows. They've been widowed because their husbands have been murdered brutally. And not only have they then had to suffer the loss of a partner, they have to go through the worst ordeal against their person. Victims, widows of conflict, as we've seen in places such as Iraq and Syria more recently. I was staggered when I looked at recent reports to learn that 80% of women in Syria are now widowed. It's a startling, horrific statistic. And many of these women have been widowed early in life. And the challenge there is that word again, culture or religion. In some interpretations, it prevents them from remarrying. I'm a Muslim, and there are Christians in this room. I send my children to Catholic schools. Now, if those are the prevalent religion of Syria, neither religion prevents a woman remarrying. Neither religion prevents a woman from rebuilding her life. So we must tackle head-on those who seek to use such barriers to allow women to rebuild their lives. In countries with high rates of child marriage, we are also seeing especially cruel phenomena of child widows. Now let's put this into context. I have a daughter who's now 13. As I learnt just now in the phone call to my wife, Shaista, she's still working on the clearing bit of her room bit, but she knows what her dad does. She often has debates with me about human rights and use of mobile telephone phones, but we'll put that to one side. But when I look at Shaista and the opportunities she has in terms of education, sport, her own development, whether going to the theatre, spending time with friends, I'm also very wary of the job I do for my government, that there are many girls of that age and younger who are not only denied those essential aspects of a young girl growing up, but actually at much earlier age are married off through forced marriage, and then subsequently have to suffer the loss of becoming a widow early in life. Again, I return to conflict zones where we've seen child marriage persist. And then that young girl not only has to be forced married off to one individual, once her husband is lost in battles, she's often then forced to marry someone else. We must put an end to forced marriage. That's why I was proud in the UK when we criminalised forced marriage, and we will continue an international campaign to end the issue of forced marriage across the globe. But these young girls, these child widows, if I could term them as such, the vast majority of them are forced to drop out of school, face early motherhood. They have not been educated. They've not even been perhaps told of what a young girl suddenly, not only seeking to develop herself, is faced with the responsibility of a young child. How can that, by any stretch of the imagination, by any so-called culture, be the right thing to do? Fundamentally, basically, by any interpretation, it is wrong. Because that early widowhood will also blight their whole life. They'll condemn children to that continued vicious circle of poverty, increased risks. And sadly, we know the daughters of widows themselves face increased vulnerability to both abuse and child marriage. We must end this vicious cycle. So let it make it clear, not just in this room, because each and every person in this room I know is committed to this objective, but for every government, every partner, for every NGO and beyond, to make that commitment, to tackle the harmful social norms and deep-rooted gender inequality that is at the heart and core of so much of the cruelty and hardship which is endured by widows, young and old. And let me assure you, the United Kingdom is committed to ending that cycle of poverty which they face, which their treatment perpetrates. Achieving gender equality, empowering all girls and women is an important, fundamental priority for the UK government. Sometimes I'm asked the question why. I'll tell you the answer I give. because fundamentally it's the right thing to do. Since 2015, UK Aid has supported more than 3 million girls to gain a decent education. It has delivered humanitarian assistance to more than 7 million women and girls, and it's provided life-saving water, sanitation, hygiene programs to almost 10 million women across the globe. Through all our development work, we are guided by the commitment woven through all the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that we live up to our bit of that great phrase, leaving no girl behind. Reaching the most marginalized in society requires a special focus. It requires determination. And let's be very clear, widows certainly deserve our special focus, which is therefore why I invite not just people in here, because you're already doing that. You are advocates. You are the champions of this cause. But together, collaboratively and collectively, that we work together in advocating progressive language in agreed Commission conclusions. We want this year's Commission on the Status of Women, which brings us to New York for the next 2 weeks, to speak with an unequivocal voice. One that recognizes the discrimination, one that recognizes the marginalization, one that recognizes the stigma faced by many widowed women, and often by their own family, friends, and communities. We must break it down. We must work together in pursuit of that objective. We must push for equality and justice for all girls and women. We must push for access to justice and social protection. I would finally just like to say that widows can achieve so much, and we must help to remove the barriers that lie in front of them. Whilst facing huge challenges and wide-ranging abuse, widows often, and we all acknowledge that, I know in this room, are the backbone of communities around the world. When properly protected, empowered, supported, widows can be powerful agents for prosperity, peace, and change. And therefore, organizations like Widows for Peace Through Democracy demonstrate the potential for widows to lead change, to bring about lasting peace, often in many parts, conflict zones around the world. We, collectively, the delegates of CSW 2019, need to commit ourselves to do all we can to make sure we harness this power. That potential, that powerful potential, is unleashed, and ensure that we do our part to relieve those women, to ease their burdens, who currently are trapped in the cage of poverty, abuse, and stigma. Let's make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Ahmed. It's great honor and privilege to have you here with us today, and I want to thank you for the support that the United Kingdom has lent to this cause. You've truly been the force of mainstreaming this new emerging human rights issue of widowhood, and we appreciate the support. If I say apartheid, can you hear me? If I say apartheid to you, if I say apartheid to you, you know what I'm talking about. And if I say FGM, you know what I'm talking about. But if I say widowhood, most of the time this is an informed audience, no one knows what we're talking about. The human rights issue of widowhood remains elusive to our global conscience, despite the fact that it impacts over 300 million women around the world, and 115 million of which live in abject poverty as a direct result of their widowhood status. In order to understand the issue of widowhood, we need to define a widow. And this is where the problem begins. You see, first there's the de facto widow, whose husband is in fact deceased. But how do you define husband? If he is a husband under statutory law, then most likely it's straightforward. But what if this husband, as most marriages in the global south are, a cultural marriage? Is there any registration of this marriage? And if there's no registration, is there any type of marriage certificate? And if there's no marriage certificate, as in most cases are, can the widow collect a death certificate? And then there's the issue of the functional widow, whose husband may have abandoned her. Has he abandoned her voluntarily, or has he abandoned her involuntarily? And if this involuntary status of her missing husband is prolonged, is it because of actions of state actors or actions of non-state actors? At which point will a government issue a death certificate for someone they may have taken? And at which point will ISIS or some other rogue entity issue a death certificate? It's impossible. It's a mess. Further complicating the issue is our own preconceived notions. As Lord Ahmed alluded to, widows are not old. 53% of the widows that we work with in the developing world, in Egypt in particular, are under the age of 39. And 100% of the widows that we work with in Tanzania were widowed under the age of 39, which invariably means they are mothers of young children. And then, of course, there's the childhood. So widows endure three main forms of violations against them. The first is disinheritance, as Lord Ahmed alluded to. The husband's family will run to collect the death certificate. Immediately, the widow is removed of her marital home. She may or may not be able to access any land or valuable assets, even those that she brought into the marriage or that she may have earned and purchased during the course of her marriage. She might not be able to inherit her own children, as different matrilineage and patrilineage customs prevent the widow from inheriting her children because their value in the estate is greater than her own. And then, if there's a bride price or dowry paid, as most of the instances there is, the widow may actually be considered property and inherited herself. The next violation against her is that of discrimination. 39 countries around the world prevent a widow from inheriting today, and 102 countries around the world have a legal, customary, or social practice that restrict a widow from access to land or valuable assets. We call this institutionalized economic violence. And then finally, there's the issue of harmful traditional practices. Most of you are familiar with this, but it often includes violent forms of abuse. Most of the time it's sexual abuse, and most of the time, again, as Lord Ahmed alluded to, it's over a prolonged period of time. And these are intended, they're culturally endorsed, and they're intended to purge the widow of the sin of her husband's death. What are the implications of these violations? The chart shows that the first is, with disinheritance, a loss of income. The widow is no longer able to service basic needs for her family, and as we've established, for her young children. This invariably means she has to remove them from school, as my grandmother had to do when she was 35 and widowed with 4 children. When she removes them from school, her instinct is to protect her daughters, and she marries them off as children. Her sons become vulnerable to radicalized indoctrination, and a recent UNDP report proved that 30% of extremist recruits come from widowed households. In terms of discrimination, she does not have access to justice. She does not have access to social protections. She has no economic opportunity. With young children and limited skills, she has a lack of ability to work, or at least achieve safe and dignified work. And finally, with harmful traditional practices come the risks of health issues, HIV, AIDS, proliferation, ostracization, fear, and shame, and the risk of being drawn into human trafficking. In all instances, she loses her voice and place in society, and it's this loss of voice that has caused widowhood to remain invisible to our global consciousness, and this we must end now. What does this all mean? Global Fund for Widows, as well as our partners in the Alliance for the Last Woman First, which is an alliance of nearly 50 organizations around the world working together to mainstream and work with widows from around the world, believes that these human rights violations against widows not only directly leads to poverty, but is deeply interconnected with all of the SDGs. And this graphic illustrates the complicated and quite frankly tragic web of the implications on the 2030 agenda. Disinheritance not only leads to poverty, SDG 1, food insecurity, SDG 2, poor health, SDG 3, poor education, SDG 4, child marriage, and the unconscionable issue of the child widow, SDG 5. It goes on and on. All of the SDGs are included. So what do widows need? As Lord Ahmed alluded to, they need economic empowerment, access to safe work, access to capital, and ability to generate a sustainable income. They need laws. They need equitable marital laws. They need access to justice, and they need criminalization of acts of disinheritance and acts of harmful traditional customs. And they need social protections. Marital protections are critical. Every marriage must be documented and registered. Every marriage, just like every birth and every death. In order to alleviate any ambiguity as to the role the widow played in her marriage, there must be clear and equitable succession laws. If married, a husband's death certificate should only be issued to his surviving widow, period. And for those who are missing, let's define a period of absence after which we may allow the widow to claim her husband as deceased, to receive a death certificate, claim an inheritance, receive benefits entitled to her, and to move on with her life. Social pensions and cash transfers we've heard a lot about during the CSW in the short 3 days we've already had. Non-contributory social pension plans that are inclusive of informal work are critical to alleviating the burden of poverty for widows, and they should be adequate. Having spoken with widows' organizations from around the world, 5.4 million widows at this time, the key and number one social protection that they ask for is keep my kids in school. So let's keep our kids in school. Allow me to share 3 quick examples of success stories from around the world that have countries that have implemented these social protections. The first is Namibia. They implemented the Married Persons Equality Act in 1996, giving equal rights to women in marriage, including ownership of all assets in the estate on a 50-50 basis. And they banned marital power, which placed the man as head of household. The result? Namibia ranks 10th in the world in the gender gap index. That's higher than this country, that's higher than France, that's higher than, I'm sorry, Your Excellency, it's higher than the United Kingdom. And it is also receives highest marks in the African Union's Economic Empowerment Scorecard. SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, and 16 achieved. In India, they implemented the Indira Gandhi Widows Pension Scheme in 2009 to address poverty among India's 46 million widows via cash transfer to a bank or post office account. The results have shown an improvement in the burden of poverty for widows receiving the cash transfer. But more importantly, it elevated their sense of social worth. It elevated their sense of self-worth and their social status within their community because they were seen as a woman of means with a bank account. SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 achieved. And finally, in South Africa, this slide reminds me that Mom always knows best. South Africa implemented the Child Support Grant in 1998, which guarantees schooling up to the age of 18. 55% of South Africa's children benefit from this fund. 98% of them are living with either a widow or female head of household. The results speak for themselves. Poverty was reduced by 5% in headcount, but 45% from the destitution gap. Underage pregnancy dropped 45%. Women were able to not only increase their own personal household savings, but they also opened bank accounts. SDG 1, 2, 3, 5, 11, and 16 achieved. So with that, I hope that I've been able to convey the gravity and magnitude of the elusive and yet emerging issue of widowhood to ensure that global poverty is alleviated, but also allow us to achieve the SDGs, ensuring that we leave no one behind. Thank you. Yeah, Diana? Wait. Let's do
Hello, I'm Lois Herman. I am the coordinator of One Run, the Women's UN Report Network, and we are absolutely part of a widows advocacy movement around the world. I'd like to just bring up several points that make this activism even more challenging. One, are half widows. In Kashmir and in other places, there is the dynamic of half widow. Who is a half widow? She's someone whose husband has disappeared. Maybe he's been seized by military, but he hasn't been declared dead. And so she likely is not entitled to any widow's benefits. Another dynamic is polygamous marriage widows. When there are several wives in sequence, the legal rights are complicated, whether or not there is a registered marriage. Another issue is sequential marriages, as in the United States and Canada, the Western Hemisphere. If there are sequential marriages, as in this country where we are now, each wife who's married over 15 years is entitled to file for Social Security benefits of that man. And then there are migrant women. I live in Italy, and we have a flood of migrants coming in, particularly from North Africa. And these women, when they enter, come either with a husband or eventually have a husband. But their marriage is not legal because they are undocumented. So if he should pass away and she is a widow, she is essentially left without the support that she would hope to have. Okay, so our next speaker today, and notice the diversity in the countries represented, not only in our presentations, but also here in this audience. Thank you. The next speaker is Andrina Michaela, and she is with the Malawi Widows Association.
Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, as I have already been introduced, I'm the chairperson for Widows Association in Malawi. Our association is a newly created association. We are barely after registration, 6 months. But we have been working underground, trying to help widows. So the scenario I'm going to give is what exists in Malawi at the moment. I'm so happy to be here this morning to articulate issues that affect our widows in Malawi. And I thank you, Madam, for giving me a space to do so. Chairperson, women in Malawi comprise the majority in the sense that 52% of the total population of Malawi is women. And Malawi is a small country. Maybe some of you have never heard about it. As most cases when I'm saying, I come from Malawi, they'll say, are you from Mali? I say, no, I'm not from Mali. It's a small country, but our population is so big. We are 17 million current population. But out of that 17 million, 1.2 million are widows. Just to give the magnitude of widowhood in the country and in a impoverished country. The GDP, Malawi survives, most of women survive on $1, less than $1 a day. If I was to bring pictures of how Malawian women live, some of you will be scared to say, does a person live in this house? And for widows, it's even worse. So now when we talk of the widowhood in Malawi, it's a group of women that are more vulnerable, very vulnerable, because when you talk of gender inequality in totality, we are not talking of the widow. In most cases, the forums, they don't talk about the widow. It's not targeting, especially with the program that we are running. So I just want to present what we have to ensure that a widow is looked at and helped. So treatment of widows in Malawi, just like in other parts of the world, I've heard from our speaker, the Lord, here from UK. The women, just like in other parts of the world, are generally defined by the culture, tradition, religion, and beliefs. Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, disempowerment and challenges that a widow faces do not start at the time when the lady is widowed. I want to emphasize this. This starts right from the childhood in the context of Malawi. Because when you are born, a woman is, or a girl, you should say girl, a young girl, is treated differently from the boy. So there's a great disparity between a girl and a boy, a man and a woman in terms of education, employment, accessibility to credit, and even political participation. So that being the case, a woman is put at a lower leverage as compared to a man. And that status continues even after marriage. So in Malawi, the widows are marginalized and abused in so many different ways. It has already been articulated, and I think the scenarios are the same, but still we'll emphasize what happens in Malawi. Marginalization and vulnerability increases increases, especially when everything has been taken away by the family members. Widows no longer become resilient to shocks because of the little assets that they have been taken away. In Malawi, just like many other member states, women face serious challenges, including food insecurity. I think this is number one. Due to lack of farm inputs, they don't have the money to buy farm inputs. They lack land because of matrilineal type of system and patriarchal type of system. Even if the matrilineal type of system, the land still belongs to the man. So you cannot access to the land. And in most cases, failure to find even school fees for the children. It has already been said by earlier speakers that children born from the widows in Malawi. Yeah, I was widowed at the age of 42. And when you are widowed, the amount of money that you have, you so more or less like be dependent on the man. And when the man passes on, it means you are crippled. So school fees becomes a big issue. And indeed, fortunate for me because I went through a proper education, I was able to provide. I was able to work hard and provide for my children. But most of the women in Malawi, the children do not continue their education. And as such, the trend, which has already been mentioned here, the children are forced to go either in prostitution or to go beg, early marriages, and then this sort of creates a vicious cycle of poverty. So this is the scenario which we are facing. So we are saying when everything is taken away, the confidence and esteem of a widow dwindles in most cases. In the context of Malawi, there are many customs and practices that people follow when death occurs in a family. Many of these practices are harmful to the widow, emotionally, physically, and financially. I'll just mention some that maybe you might not have heard about. So when they take away everything, decisions are imposed mostly by the family in-laws. These decisions are often not to the widow's benefit, nor does it take in the wishes into account. Even if the husband provided for his wife in the event of death, widows oftentimes have no assurance of the accessibility of the provision. What we are saying is, you could have a will. In some people who are already educated, they could have a will, but that will is never, honored, so to say, because of the patriarchal type of system that we have. Men are stronger, and they are able to buy the systems to support each other. So extreme poverty in widows is aggravated by widespread property grabbing. Whatever little the husband has left, it will be taken away. A widow cannot even be sure that she will be allowed to keep the money and the property that she herself worked for and earned. Save for some of us who are clever enough, they didn't grab anything from me. The relatives or husbands, when the relatives, when the husband passes away, it's usually on the property, the focus on the property that the brother or cousin has left behind, because the beneficiary in most cases is not only the direct relatives, even those that are extended family members, they come and grab everything. Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, when everything has been taken away, now you look at the woman in Malawi, the woman is at a loss. As I have already said, the woman, in many cases, is a victim of now the culture, because I want to emphasize on the culture, which is impacting so much on our ladies in Malawi. The tradition differ from countryside, from the north, center, and the south. But the one which is so bad is the one that is used to cleanse ritual spirit, to cleanse you from the perceived notion that you carry the bad spirit of your husband. So somebody has to cleanse you. And this cleansing means you have to have sexual interface with a brother, a cousin of your deceased husband. And in most cases, this poses a problem to health of the woman, because you never know whom they have given you to cleanse you. The system is so entrenched in some of these culture, to the extent that the government has been talking about it. There are laws that bar this type of system, but because the patriarchal system and the traditional leaders benefit a lot from it, it has now gone underground. You don't talk about it. Somebody has died, you still find that the person has been cleansed. So that is one of the issues which we are having as a big problem for our widows. So HIV/AIDS has become a threat to the women that lose their husbands. Apart from that particular part of the country where there's this cleansing of a woman, then there's inheritance. When you are married, in this particular sector, or half of the country, you are supposed to pay dowry. I think dowry is common to even in India and other parts of West Africa. When they pay dowry, it means you are a property to the family of the husband. And when the husband passes on, you are supposed to be still a property of that particular clan. So they give you somebody to inherit you. And when they inherit you, they inherit the property as well. And this also has its own repercussions or problems. So the culture issues are the ones that we are now facing, and we are fighting for proper laws to protect the women. But our laws, even if they have been passed, we have passed several laws in the country. For instance, Gender Equality Act 2013, which addresses the issues of harmful practices. We have a law, Deceased Estate, Wills, Inheritance and Protection Act, which was passed in 2010, which focuses on the issue of disposal of deceased estate and fighting the practice of property grabbing. But when you look at these laws, they are not binding. And not many people know about them. This is where we have a big challenge as a country. We have to sensitize women. We have to sensitize not only the widows. As we have said, widowhood starts before you are even widowed. You have to know how to protect yourself in case you become a widow. This is where we are saying, no, as a country or as an association, what should we do to help those that are going to be widowed, to help those that are already widowed? So, as I've indicated, the laws have not been popularized to the grassroots women, and this is our main challenge, Madam Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen, now I will mention what is it that we are doing to help ourselves, because we have looked at the problems. Now we are saying, yes, we have established an association, the Widows Association. That Widows Association is in its infancy. And we are looking upon our colleagues to help us, to learn from you people how you have managed to address the issue of widows. But lastly, I would say we are working or being helped by our colleagues from Action Aid, and those are the ones that are helping us to come up with the proper programs. And in conclusion, let me point out these very critical issues. We, as the widows, I think we have been marginalized for a long time. What we are appealing is, can we have programs that are inclusive and maybe looking at the widow as a special person? Thank you for your attention. I have a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It may seem hard for us to imagine that when a woman becomes a widow, her family and her late husband's family compete for the land and the property, and that she is excluded. An example of where that happens often is in India. India has the most widows in the world. I say something like 1 in every 3 households or families has a widow. In other parts of the world, including in Africa, a widow may be accused of witchcraft, that she is a witch and she caused her husband to die. In India and in some other countries, it was also expected until a number of years ago that when the husband died, and they had a funeral pyre to burn his body, that it was most honorable for the widow to throw herself on the funeral pyre with her husband. And one last note is internally displaced persons. If your country is in conflict and you are internally displaced, as has been in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in so many countries, then if you become a widow, you have a challenge, a monumental challenge, because A, you may not have your documents to show you were legally married if you were, and that means for your children's rights as well. But your government maybe has collapsed, and the invader government or the forces that are occupying your country don't have any interest in widows' pensions. Our next speaker is Zarin Hainsworth from UK. She is the director of Widows' Rights International, and she has also been attentive to drawing younger women to awareness of widows' issues.
So, thank you very much, everybody, for turning up at this event. It's great that you're here. Thank you for the wonderful panel, and thank you for Heather and the Global Fund for Widows for having this event. Can you hear me now? Better, great. Okay, wave at the back if you can't hear. I spoke to Lord Ahmed. I really would like to pay tribute to the UK government. Of course I would, because I'm from the UK. But anyway, I'd like to also pay tribute because it's not always that you can be really proud of your country. At the moment, as you know, we're going through a bit of a... we're really grateful for DFID and the Foreign Office because the UK government is really showing commitment to this issue. And as Lord Ahmed said, it has been a previously neglected issue, and they are doing something about it. And so therefore, I really think that when a States Party do something for us, we should really applaud it and celebrate it. They're great together. Okay. A 12-year-old girl in India was asked about her marriage. And she said, I don't really remember much about it. I didn't know what was going on. I was 6. And I think what we need to remember behind all of these statistics that we've heard about is try to really connect with the person of that statistic. What must it be like for a 6-year-old girl to be wed and suddenly she loses everything? She loses her childhood. She loses her possibilities. She loses her education. And in many cultures, she loses her voice. So early and forced marriage, as we've already heard, is a complete denial of human rights. And it is a stain on humanity that we are still allowing it to happen. All of us in this room allow that to take place unless we act forcibly to prevent it. So all of us here at CSW must work with our civil society colleagues and with our states parties to ensure that they know that we believe that it can no longer continue. So early and forced marriage is a huge problem, especially in some countries. So we know that in Afghanistan, in India, in Nepal, we have a huge number of early and forced marriage, child marriage. We don't really know the stats. You've heard some stats, we bandy them about. But the problem is there is no real robust data. We don't have stats disaggregated by marital status. We don't really know how many women are married at what age. Girls Not Brides has some idea, UNICEF has some idea, we have some data. Where does the data come from? What's the kind of censuses that have them? How many countries have really efficient offices for national statistics? So how do we know where these stats come from? How do we know how valuable they are? How do we know how robust they are? So unless we fight and call for actively making sure that in this CSW agreed conclusions we ask for statistics disaggregated by marital status, how will we ever know how many girls are married and how many are then widowed? Because inevitably you have somebody who is married off at 6 to somebody who is 30, it's very likely that he will die before she does. I mean, seriously. So, we know that there's going to be an increase in widowhood as we have, as men die off, as they do, especially with the amount of conflict that we have. So we know there's going to be an increase in widowhood. So then the child widow not only has lost everything because she's a child bride, she then has to face the massive discrimination that is widowhood in most countries in the world. Maybe in the US, certainly in the UK, if you spoke to somebody in the street and you told them widows, they would imagine an older woman with a healthy pension. That is not the reality even in the UK. Because of the feminization of poverty, and older women are the most poor generally. So widows, older widows, even in the UK, are also suffering, especially because of pension rights. But in other parts of the world, you've already heard about the harmful traditional practices, her loss of inheritance, her invisibility in terms of legislation. And even where there is legislation, it's not implemented. So we've heard the number of countries where there are laws that actively prevent women from inheriting. But even those countries where there are laws that give her rights, she often is not able to achieve them. So imagine a child, married at 6, married at 12, married at 15, and then widowed. She loses things twice. So what happens when they take away everything? Well, society takes away her childhood, and then they take away all of her possibilities because she's then widowed. And we've heard about the cycles of deprivation. What about the Boko Haram girl who's married early in her village? Boko Haram comes and kills off the village, kills off the men. She's then taken and she becomes a widow of Boko Haram. And then Boko Haram are killed. She's already widowed twice by the time she's 17. What happens to her? What's her future? What's her life like? What happens when we've heard of women who are very poor? They are less than $1 a day. They have no education. They have no options. They can't pay a dowry price. What happens to those girls? They're forced into prostitution. They're trafficked. And we have the cycle of deprivation. In some countries, you have generations of widows. A woman marries off her daughter. She then gets pregnant. She marries off her daughter. So you have generations of widows, all developing a cycle of deprivation. And this is something we can do something about. What is lacking is our political will. Our political will in this room, at this CSW, among civil society, among states parties. It's great that the UK has taken some leadership and we should applaud them. But we need to force, fight, call, berate, beseech the UK to use your power among other states parties and make sure that this no longer remains a neglected issue, no longer remains hidden, no longer remains silent, and we ensure that every single child, every single girl in the world never faces to become a bride when she's still a girl, without her consent, without a voice. And then, if she does lose her husband, she doesn't have to face the discrimination that is accorded widows. And unless we do that, we will not have peace and prosperity in the world. There are more widows in the world than any other minority group. Over 300 million. And then you just think about their families. What about all their children? We have an organisation in Tanzania called Nasarian. It's a polygamous organisation, the Maasai. They have usually about 8 kids. And usually about 6 to 8 wives in a family. When we go to Tanzania, we drive off from the village and we go to visit some of the widows. We pass by a school, and it's a school just for the children of one man, over 80 or so kids. We had one guy who was on our group when we were traveling, and we saw him in 2010, and he said that his father was 80, and he had 80 brothers and sisters. And then we saw him 3 years later, and he had 83 brothers and sisters. So the 80-year-old was, going at it, mate. So Thank you very much for your time.
You know, in the United States, being a widow isn't all that easy as well, because I always tell women they should have a lockbox, and in the lockbox they should put the deed to their house and all their marriage and birth certificates. Everything is important, because what you face here is not having socialized medicine, not having the ability to connect with the public system. You may get Medicare, but they're cutting that back. And so women who are widows who were born, let's say, during World War II, they do not have the same mentality of preparing for the possibility of widowhood. So it's not all easy, but certainly different than you describe in Tanzania or we hear in Malawi. Okay, our next speaker is Diana Kamande, and she is with Come Together Widows and Orphans Organization in Kenya.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Heather, and the team for making sure that this happens today. I'm sorry I came in late. I was trying to sort out something. I'm a widow myself, and this is why this topic is so dear to my heart. I will not speak much about myself, but I want to say what happens when you become a widow. But there is also a solution. And as I said in our last meeting that was organized by Widows' Rights International, I think it is time for us as Kenyans not only to speak about widows' abuse, but also to speak about after it has happened. We should not dwell there. It happened. I'm an example of a widow who was disinherited. But one thing I've learned, widowhood can give you a voice. If you decide to come out of that cocoon that you have built, you can get a voice. It is because of widowhood that I've decided that I can reach out and get to tell people of what was happening in Kenya, and they can come on board and we can change the situation. This is how I met Heather. I didn't know Heather. We kept communicating via emails. So today, what happens when you become a widow, or to the widows that you're leading, or to the widows that you meet, tell them widowhood is power. It is power to speak. It is power to reach out and tell other people, as the former president of US used to say, yes, we can. We join the people of Malawi in telling them, yes, we can do it in Malawi if we are doing it in Kenya. It is not the responsibility of the government to enlighten you about the laws. Can you reach out to other civil society organizations and they come and train your widows to become paralegals? When you have a case in court, in Kenya what we do, we print t-shirts, we go to court, and we ask for rights as a unified team, because together we can do it. We have laws in Kenya that were not working, but today they are working. If you don't walk out and let people know you are existing, they will sit on you. In a meeting I attended when I landed here, one of our ladies from Kenya said, if women are not on the table to make decisions, they are going to be the meal. So if widows are not on the decision-making tables, and this is what I want to promise you, in the next election in Kenya, I'm going to lead widows to go for elective positions. I think it is time to change the narrative on widowhood, because it is the man who went. He didn't live with me. And when the society tries to prove me wrong, I should not help them in proving myself wrong. I should prove myself right and show them my strength. I was not talkative when I had a husband. Today, I can stand on top of the mountain and speak. That's why I'm saying widowhood is strength. I'm not looking at widowhood negatively. I had never traveled to the US until I became a widow. Widowhood is sweet. It is because of widowhood that my government finds a reason to sponsor me to come and speak. So how do you say it is not sweet? So you can change the narrative. Let's change the language. It happened, it was bad, but it is our responsibility to unite and say yes we can and change the language. So today, I want to applaud Heather because of the work she's helping us do in Kenya. Once I go back, we are launching the first Widows Circle in Kenya, funded by Global Funds for Widows, and the team that supports Global Funds for Widows that is here today. And I want to welcome you to Kenya, because this year we are having a groundbreaking of the first center for widows in Kenya. This center is where we are going to train widows to become lawyers, leave alone becoming paralegals. We want them now to get the paralegal education, and in turn, they decide on themselves to go back to school. We are going to give them vocational training skills, because the reason as to why they are abused, they got married at the ages Zareen was telling us about. So they never got an opportunity to go to school. It's never too late. So I welcome you aboard, because we can. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our esteemed panelists today, and I want to welcome our final speaker. Because of the sensitivity and personal danger, I would ask that you turn off all video taping devices, please.